Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the 15th episode of the Climate Conundrum podcast. Today, we are going to dive deep into something very important. In a month from today, there is the COP event happening, and we are all gearing up for that. All of the people working in the climate space, it's a huge event. So, we thought we could bring you an episode that would help you understand the main issue that is going to come up in that event this year. It's being marked as the Finance Cup. And to do that, we have Arjun Dutt with us. He is a senior program lead at the Center for Energy Finance at India's leading think tank, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, also known as CEEW. So welcome to the show, Arjun.
Thank you so much, Sanika. I'm delighted to be here on your podcast. I'll take this opportunity to just introduce myself to your listeners, if that's okay.
Please do, please.
So, hello everyone. I'm Arjun Dutt. I'm a public policy professional and I work, as Sanika said, at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, or CEEW. CEEW is one of Asia's leading not for profit policy research institutions, and we seek to impact sustainable development at scale using data, integrated analysis, and strategic outreach. At CEEW, I'm a senior program lead at the Center for Energy Finance. At the Center for Energy Finance, we aim to accelerate the flow of affordable finance towards clean energy and more broadly towards sustainability across emerging economies. We do this by developing financial solutions to address bottlenecks in the flow of capital. We develop sector-specific financial solutions to advance the decarbonization of power, of industry, of transportations, sectors which have an outsized carbon footprint. At the same time, we also work on cross-cutting levers such as sustainable finance regulation, carbon markets, and international climate change negotiations to bend the flow of capital towards sustainability. And before CW, I used to work in the private sector, primarily in corporate finance and equity research. But even in those roles, what was common was my keen interest in the intersection of energy, finance, and geopolitics. So Sanika, thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this very timely conversation on a very interesting topic for me.
Thanks, Arjun. This was a great introduction, and it also lends um, a more curious approach because your work has been in this field. So I'm really excited to dig into today's topic of conversation, which is climate finance. As you all know, this term is used pretty loosely, largely, and often you might hear about negotiations around climate finance and developing countries, developed countries, money flowing between these. And there's a lot to unpack. So I think today we're going to focus on a couple of um, basic things because this is a huge, complex field. And as you know, Arjun, you've been spending years researching it and you're still probably just hitting the surface, right? So yeah, let's dig into the first basic question as to what is climate finance?
Right, let's start with the basics. So, an easy way to understand climate finance is in terms of its end users and sources. So, in terms of end users, climate finance is financing that facilitates greenhouse gas emissions mitigation and climate adaptation actions that collectively tackle climate change. So mitigation refers to measures that reduce or prevent the flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. For example, increasing the share of renewable energy in power generation. On the other hand, adaptation entails anticipating the adverse effects of climate change and taking suitable steps to lessen the damage that these can cause. So examples are, for example, building coastal embankments to prevent or protect against sea level rise, and early warning systems to protect against extreme weather events. So in terms of end users, climate finance is the financing of climate mitigation and adaptation. From the perspective of sources, climate finance may be drawn from either public sources, which usually have a developmental mandate, or private sources, that is private capital, that usually has a profit motive. And further, climate finance may be drawn from domestic sources or international sources. That is, climate finance can also flow across borders. So with that, we come to that important question that you asked. Why is climate finance important? Now, when we talk about investments in mitigation and adaptation, a lot of what that entails is investments in hard physical assets. Think about mitigation. You have things like solar panels, wind turbines, electrolyzers. And in terms of adaptation, you have things like storm shelters, coastal embankments, all hard physical assets. Now, these physical assets are capital intensive and majority funded by debt. So while climate action is contingent on the deployment of these hard physical assets, their deployment in turn is contingent on the availability of finance. Therefore, that's where climate finance comes into the picture, and that's why it's critical for climate action.
Thank you. This was an elaborate answer, but I think simple enough for us to understand, right? To sum up, I guess I can say climate finance is important, or rather, what is climate finance? It is just the global flow of money from places that have capacity to provide capital for helping developing as well as the developed countries adapt and mitigate to the changes in the environment right now. So it can involve right from heavy infrastructural activities to perhaps even capacity building and skilling workers, right?
Absolutely.
Great. Now, Arjun, I'm also interested. See, there is so much talk about financial markets. And when we talk about climate finance flowing globally, how much are we seeing of it? Is it enough? What is the capital that we're talking about?
Right. Well, the short answer is it's not enough. But to elaborate on that, so the Climate Policy Initiative reports on global climate finance flows. Per the latest figures, the global flow of climate finance is around $1.3 trillion per year. Now, to answer the question of is it enough, how does this compare with the flows required to meet global climate goals? Let's consider the goal of net zero global carbon emissions by the year 2050, which will allow us a reasonable chance of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, consistent with the Paris Agreement. So for meeting this target, per the New Delhi Declaration of India's G20 presidency, we need at least $4 trillion per year by the year 2030 in clean energy applications alone. And overall, we need between $4 to $6 trillion per year for a global transformation to a low carbon economy. And this is as per COP27's Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. Finally, UNEP also talks about the adaptation finance requirements of developing countries, where it says that for this decade, developing countries need between $215 to $387 billion per year for every year in this decade for adaptation. So if I were to put all those figures together, current flows of 1.3 trillion need to at least quadruple for us to stand a chance of meeting global climate goals.
Those are huge numbers.
Huge number.
Yeah. And yeah, I will get to whether we are there yet and where they're coming from. But I think we can then try and unravel how are they being distributed, what are the key areas in which money is flowing towards, where is money flowing from? So can you help us understand that?
Yeah, so I think a good way to start is that the way we define climate finance in terms of end users and sources, maybe one way is to look at where money is flowing in terms of end users and which sources it's coming from. So in terms of end users, the vast majority of global climate finance flows, that is around 91%, flow towards mitigation. And only a small proportion, that is around 5%, flows towards adaptation, with another 4% flowing towards cross-cutting end users, that is end users with both adaptation and mitigation components. Now, this is in large part a reflection of the fact that the business case for several mitigation end users is well established. For example, renewable energy, electric mobility, and money flows readily as investors are able to make adequate returns on their investment. Now, in contrast, a number of adaptation investments either don't have any revenue streams attached with them at all, or investors are not able to make commercial returns on their investment. As a result of this, the global flow of capital is climate finance is basically skewed towards mitigation. And so that was end users. But if we look at even the sources, the split between, say, the share of public and private capital towards adaptation and mitigation will reflect the disparity in commercial viability.
Mm-hmm.
So if we consider the global flows towards adaptation, of these, only 2% are sourced from the private sector. And this is primarily because, like I said, investors are not able to make adequate returns on their investments. And therefore, the bulk of this, 98%, comes from public sources where, these sources of capital have a developmental mandate. Coming to mitigation, where the business case is much better established, here there is a much more even split between private and public. So 53% of flows are private capital and 47% are public. And this is obviously a reflection of the superior sort of business case for mitigation investments.
Can you help understand what that means? Why is this business case better? Why are people more interested in these aspects?
So ultimately, the business case depends on whether the investors are able to make appropriate returns on their investments. So firstly, let's say if we were to consider renewable energy, the returns that investors get are the payments from distribution utilities that are the counterparties in power purchase agreements. So there's a predictable flow of, revenue. And of course, that in the case of India, for example, the tariffs are determined through a transparent auction mechanism, and where the investor is able to have full clarity on what sort of contract he's entering into. The costs of this business are very well understood, and therefore there is much more predictability in terms of the returns. If I were to just contrast it with something like, say, coastal embankment, you don't get money. Nobody's paying you money, as like a revenue stream for building that. Or if you were to build a storm shelter, are you really getting money for any? No developer is getting money, because typically a government is building that to protect people from, say, cyclones. So that's one major difference. And of course, even in the case of mitigation, not all applications are at the same level of commercial viability, but in general, there is superior commercial viability in mitigation versus adaptation.
Great, thank you. So in terms of the geographical split, we know about the private-public split now, but in terms of the global finances moving, how are we looking at this? I can imagine that this is more of a developed countries to a developing country sort of a situation. But is there a pattern that you've observed? Are there interesting trends that you can foresee as well?
Absolutely. And developing countries is a useful lens to look at this, because both are different stages of development and have different requirements in terms of climate finance. So the current pattern of flow is that the global flow of climate finance is sort of evenly split between developed and developing countries, with a small majority, 53%, flows towards developing countries and around 47% towards developed countries. Now, a couple of quick qualifiers on the developing country flows. A large chunk of this is actually concentrated in China, which has the largest share of all global climate finance flows of any country, developed or developing, across the world. A second aspect is that most of the world's population actually lives in developing countries, and this only receives about half of climate finance flows. We need a much larger scale of investments in these countries to ensure the success of global climate action. And in fact, these countries need external finance support, and I'd be happy to elaborate on that in detail as to why that is the case.
Yes, please, of course.
And yeah, so this, in fact, because this is a very important question, Sanika. And to answer this, let me start with a bit of context on the linkage between the state of development of various countries and their historical, carbon emissions. Now, as per the 6th assessment report of the IPCC, developed countries account for 57% of the cumulative emissions since 1850 to the present day.
Mm-hmm.
And this despite the fact that developed countries have much smaller populations than in the developing world. Therefore, on a per capita basis, developed country emissions are much higher than those in the developing world. In contrast, in the developing countries, even now, as per the IEA, there are around 700 million people without access to electricity itself. Now, developing countries need to enhance energy access because energy access is a fundamental aspect of development, fundamental determinant of development, even. So these countries need to universalize access and increase their consumption of electricity and materials on the pathway to higher standards of development. So ideally, they should not be forced into choosing between development and climate action. If, however, they are to pursue the two simultaneously, that is both development and climate action, external finance should be made available to them. Further, developing countries face certain financial constraints in climate action. So, for example, compared to developed countries, developing countries have far smaller domestic financial systems as a percentage of their GDP. In other words, their domestic financial systems are much smaller relative to the size of their economies in the developing world. As a result, developing countries would find it more challenging to effect an economy-wide transformation towards a low-carbon and climate-resilient entity compared to developed countries. And in addition, the cost of capital for climate-related investments in developing countries is much higher than in the developed world because of the risk perceptions associated with investing in these countries. So because of all these factors, it is important, in fact, imperative for the success of global climate action to support climate action in developing countries with external financial resources. And this is something that the world sort of agrees on under the UNFCCC, and which is why climate finance is an integral part of climate negotiations under that umbrella.
Absolutely right. And what you mentioned, energy is like a very basic way in which we all understand how a country is developing, where their emissions are going. And it is unfair to expect that countries who are just emerging, where rural areas, people still don't have access to electricity or water, should change suddenly to reduce their carbon impacts just because now we are at a threat tipping point. While that is the case, the debate continues on all international forums where the money should flow from, who deserves how much, and why as well. So can you help understand that? Basically, the idea being who decides the money flow and how are these metrics sort of understood?
Right. So in fact, very well put. World leaders were sort of scratching their heads in the early 1990s. And in 1992, they sort of descended upon Rio de Janeiro in Brazil for what was known as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And this is also colloquially known as the Earth Summit. And that sort of name is better known. And the Earth Summit focused on the impact of human activities on the environment. And basically, many of the questions that you were talking about were sort of subject matters of that. One of the consequences of the Earth Summit was the signing and ratification of a new international treaty known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC. The name UNFCCC is also applied to the secretariat that supports the operation of this convention. So the UNFCCC basically provides a forum for countries of the world to come together to collectively figure out how to tackle climate change. So two of the foundational principles of the UNFCCC, drawing on the sort of thread that you initiated this conversation with, were the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, or CBDRRC. It's a rather long acronym.
There's a lot of acronyms here. UNFCCC, CDR.
RC, yeah, CBDRRC. So yeah, it takes a bit of getting used to, but it's part of the territory. So CBDRRC is one principle, and of course, another principle is the principle of equity. So what CBDRRC means is that it acknowledges that combating climate change is a shared obligation of all countries. But countries have varying responsibilities in their, in terms of doing so, in terms of combating climate change. This is because they've had varying historical responsibilities in the emissions that caused climate change. As we discussed earlier, it's developed countries that have had the primary responsibility in causing global warming. At the same time, developed and developing countries vary in their respective capabilities to take climate action, with developed countries better equipped relative to developing countries. So that's CBDRRC. And of course, equity means that there should be a fair distribution of both benefits as well as responsibilities. So drawing on these principles, the UNFCCC acknowledged what we were talking about earlier, that developing countries require external financial support. So under the Copenhagen Accord of 2009, this arrangement was formalized where developed countries committed to providing financial support for climate action in developing countries. And this was to start at $30 billion between 2010 to 2012 and rise thereafter to an annual target of $100 billion per year by the year 2020. So that's the sort of genesis of UNFCCC and how the climate finance, aspects of it came about. But of course, making a promise is one thing. Have they really kept it? That's the real question.
Absolutely right. And important to hear about the Copenhagen Accord as well, because that becomes an important part as well in this discussion. We did touch upon it earlier, but can you explain that as well? Because I think along with the UNFCCC formation and the discussions that followed it, I think the Copenhagen Accord is an important step going forward in this discussion.
Right. So in terms of what was agreed, this was at COP15 in Copenhagen. Ultimately, the idea was that what scale of finance should be made available to developing countries from the developed world. And there was a lot of political wrangling and negotiation, and ultimately a figure of 100 billion was agreed, right? It doesn't necessarily have an analytical basis. It's more of a political sort of compromise. And the figures were to rise to 100 billion per year by the year 2020. Of course, there were 30 billion between 2010 and 2012. And ultimately, in terms of the UNFCCC classifies countries as Annex 1, Annex 2, and non-Annex 1 countries. So Annex 2 are the set of developed countries that are expected to provide this financial support to developing countries. And developing countries are basically called non-Annex 1 countries. These were countries that were considered developing back in the early 1990s when the UNFCCC was set up. Of course, some of these are also now have higher standards of living, and that's a separate debate, and we'll get to that later. But that's the general sort of structure and sort of setup here. Developed countries, Annex 2 countries, are to provide financial support for climate action in non-Annex 1 countries.
Was that 100 billion target met?
That's an interesting question. And in fact, that's one of the contentious aspects of the climate negotiation. So to understand this, the OECD basically reports annually on progress towards this 100 billion per year target. Per the latest report that was released earlier this year, the OECD claims that the 100 billion per year target was finally achieved in 2022, which in any case is 2 years behind schedule because it was supposed to be achieved in 2020. However, I should note that this was reportedly achieved because there is considerable controversy about whether it was achieved in the first place. Because several developing countries and observers have stated that there are problems in terms of the accuracy, the methodology, and verifiability of the OECD figures. So let me explain why they say this. So one of the criticisms about the OECD's figures is that some of these figures are actually just commitments made by developed countries to provide climate finance, and they're not followed up with actual flows. So they're just commitments and not flows, a portion of the reported figures. Another criticism is that some of these figures are simply a reclassification of existing developmental aid committed to developing countries and simply rebranded as climate. So in that case,
new wine. That's sort of no, rather
exactly,
opposite.
exactly. Old wine in a different bottle. So that's not new and additional wine, or basically new and additional finance in this case. A third aspect is that the OECD's reporting allows multilateral development banks and bilateral agencies of developed countries to basically self-report on the climate relevance of their projects. So because of this self-reporting, there's a possibility of over-reporting or inflating the figures of climate finance that these organizations are providing. So that's one sort of loophole in it. And lastly, the OECD's figures sort of, they span public climate finance that is provided on market terms or market rates of interest to developing countries. They also include public climate finance provided on concessional rates, and they include the private finance that the public climate finance mobilizes. But the flaw here is that observers in developing countries claim that actually it should just be the concessional aspects and grants that should be counted. Because if a developing country has to pay market rates of interest on debt that is provided to it, that can happen even outside the ambit of the UNFCCC. Then why should that count as climate finance support at all, right? So that is a fourth aspect of the criticism. And in fact, so I said developing countries and observers. One of these observers, that is Oxfam International, quantitatively assesses what it, per its definition, or this sort of revised definition that emerges from this critique of OECD flows, how much those figures change. So, I think it'd be useful for the listeners to understand what Oxfam talks about in terms of climate finance. If it's okay, I'll talk a bit about that as well.
Yes, please.
Right. So Oxfam publishes what it calls a climate finance shadow report. Basically, what it is a critique of the figures reported by the OECD. So Oxfam makes 3 adjustments to the figures reported by the OECD. First, it completely excludes private finance flows that are, even those that are mobilized by public climate finance. That's one adjustment. It makes 2 other adjustments to the public climate finance reported by the OECD. The first is it adjusts down figures to counteract the effect of possible over-reporting of climate relevance. So one of the flaws that I talked about. And the second is it arrives at a grant equivalent figure of the climate finance reported by the OECD. So making all these adjustments results in a figure reported by Oxfam that's considerably different from the OECD. For example, the latest figures reported for the year 2022, OECD reports that 115.9 billion of climate finance was delivered, meaning that the 100 billion target was met. Oxfam, on the basis of its own definition, says that the real value of climate finance support provided was between 27.9 and 34.9. So that's less than a third of what was reported by the OECD. So as you can see, there are considerable differences in interpretation in terms of what should count as climate finance. And therefore, to answer your initial question, the target was reportedly achieved, but it wasn't really, because what others say should count as climate finance wasn't necessarily what was reflected in the overall figures.
This is interesting, but also a little disheartening to note, because then world leaders are not agreeing upon a figure. And I think we're then squabbling over how much has been done and how much money has been spent. Versus actually how much is needed for this grave crisis mode that we should be ideally in, right? I'm sure this has led to a lot of contentions in negotiations at COP. So how do people resolve this?
Well, they haven't resolved it so far. So that's why it's an ongoing debate in, or one of those evergreen debates in climate negotiations pertaining to climate finance, the very definition of climate finance itself. So again, developing countries contend that, climate finance should be actual flows and not commitments should be new and additional. The climate relevance should be properly reported, and only grant equivalents should count. So this is a debate that is unresolved and also would need to be resolved in the context of the new goal for climate mobilization that needs to be determined for the period beyond 2025, that is 2026 onwards, because the 100 billion target, the applicability was extended through to 2025. So that debate persists and needs to be resolved. Another interesting debate, Sanika, if I may, is that beyond obviously determining what the scale of that target should be, and we can talk about that subsequently, is which countries should contribute towards climate finance and which countries should receive climate finance, basically the donors and recipients.
The basic question, right? Because I think that is exactly where we started this discussion. Who gets how much of the pie and why?
Exactly. So like I mentioned, that the non-Annex 1 countries are the developing countries that are supposed to receive climate finance. However, a number of these have achieved high standards of living. For example, China, South Korea, Mexico, some of the oil-rich countries of the Middle East, all are non-Annex 1 countries.
I was just going to ask you earlier because you mentioned China, and then immediately the focus goes to the fact that China has been doing exceptionally well economically. So can we even say that it's still needing the finance?
Absolutely. And this is one of the debates. And particularly developed countries that are the original donors in this case, they contend that there should be a revision of the list of donors and recipients with the economic criteria such as GDP and per capita income, supplementing other criteria such as historical emissions in developing a revised list of donors and recipients. However, that's one position. Another position that a number of developing countries take is that there should be no revision to this distribution between donors and recipients, because doing so would require an amendment of the Paris Agreement itself. Right. Now, if there is an amendment needed of the Paris Agreement itself, that would probably distract from this entire debate around climate finance and NCQG, and could even be a negotiation tactic to basically divert people's attention elsewhere. So that's the sort of counter argument. And again, this is one of the debates that would need to be addressed along with the definition of climate finance before we even come to the other point, that is figuring out how much finance is needed for the period beyond 2025.
You mentioned the NCQG, the new Collective Quantified Goal, right? Can you just give a quick overview on what that is?
Right. So the 100 billion per year goal, which was originally applicable till 2020, was later made applicable through to 2025, right? So there is a climate finance mobilization target for developed countries to channel capital towards developing countries till the year 2025. There is no target from the year 2026 onwards. So a new target has to be determined, and this new target is called the new Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG, another acronym, to throw into the mix. So basically, what this new acronym, or NCQG, needs the negotiations, apart from who contributes, who receives, and what this should comprise in terms of climate finance definition, is how much this should be. Ultimately, the NCQG should be sized to such a magnitude that it bridges the gap between the existing flow of private finance towards developing countries, which is flowing without any external support and which is not a huge amount, and the external financing needs of developing countries for climate action. Because we discussed previously that these countries require external finance. Now, how much external finance do they need? The COP26 and COP27 presidencies constituted an independent high-level expert group, or IHLEG, another acronym, to analytically determine the needs of developing countries. So the IHLEG in its report said that developing countries, excluding China, so it excludes China from its definition of developing countries, excluding China, require $1 trillion per year by the year 2030 in external financial support for climate action. So this sort of provides a reasonable basis from which the NCQG itself could be derived. Interestingly, India, in its own submission to the UNFCCC on the NCQG has said the NCQG should be of the order of $1 trillion per year and composed primarily of grants and concessional finance. And therefore, it is sort of in the same ballpark as the figure that is proposed by the independent high-level expert group.
Wow, thanks. It makes perfect sense to reevaluate some aspects of this, but again, going back to the Paris Climate Agreement goals and then revising that would just confuse our efforts towards this common goal. Arjun, you are actually going to be present at COP this year, and I'm sure there's a lot of excitement as well as work going behind this. What are the key recommendations that you're going with, as well as what do you think are the key recommendations that will be discussed on how climate financing is channeled and what can be made better in this?
Right. So in fact, this is a very interesting question because it not only applies to the narrow ambit of negotiations at COP, but also if we circle back to the initial part of our conversation about how the global flows need to be quadrupled. I think one needs to look at those things holistically, because ultimately to achieve climate goals, it's not just the flows under UNFCCC, it's the overall flows that have to be impacted. So to answer your question, firstly, from the perspective of negotiations themselves at COP, those will be, of course, focused narrowly on the NCQG. So there, of course, sizing the NCQG to a magnitude, that we just discussed, around 1 trillion per year, or bridging the gap between that and current organic private flows is one aspect. Second, the definition that they should be new and additional, they should be flows and not commitments, and the stuff that we discussed previously in terms of the attributes. And of course, the argument about who contributes, who receives, that will be sort of resolved at COP. But from a broader perspective, to quadruple, global climate finance flows, we need to act on several fronts simultaneously. And a lot of what's to be noted is a large chunk of these flows will actually have to go towards developing countries, because these will drive the incremental flow, or these will drive the incremental growth in the demand for energy and materials just because of their developmental needs. So simultaneously, there is a need to address investment risks pertaining to investments in developing countries. At the same time, there's a need to address the capacities of existing channels of climate finance to deliver more finance and to deliver finance that is fit for purpose for addressing global challenges like climate change. So there's sort of a 3-point formula that I often sort of talk about in this context. And I'll talk about each of these 3 legs, right? The first aspect of this is policy and regulation in developing countries to create an enabling environment for investments. So what I mean by this is that policy and regulatory action in developing countries, either at the sectoral level, sectors such as green sectors, such as renewable energy or electric mobility, or cross-cutting aspects such as climate finance taxonomies and climate-related disclosures, can collectively both help address investment risks, improve the ease of doing business, and in the case of the cross-cutting aspects, the taxonomy and climate disclosures, help facilitate a linking of capital from the global north or international capital with credible investment opportunities in developing countries. So that is one aspect of creating an enabling environment and reducing investment risks for investing in developing countries. But
are there some examples? I'm going to cut you short. I'm sorry, but can you give an example maybe on a country doing this, or some case study that you've observed that has?
So all countries do this, and to varying degrees. Of course, the extent to which their policies and regulations are effective in moderating investment risks vary greatly. So India is a great success story. We have our policy and regulation in renewables has resulted in us having one of the lowest tariffs in the world, and largely on market basis with very little support from the government. And also we're the 4th largest market in terms of renewable energy. So India is a success story in terms of renewable energy, in terms of mobility and other aspects of this. So basically, the point I'm making is that all countries make policies for these sectors. It just depends on to what extent they are, successful. A new frontier in this, of course, is while you have sectoral policies, there are certain cross-cutting regulations which are in the nature of financial regulation, because now even financial regulators and supervisors are getting involved because climate change is a material risk even for the financial sector, right?
Absolutely.
So frameworks such as taxonomies, which is basically a classification system that in a binary way identifies what is green and what is non-green, so that investors know where to put their money. And this mitigates challenges such as greenwashing. And similarly, other aspects such as asking corporates and to disclose on the implications of their activities on the climate and vice versa. Climate-related disclosures again gives investors a chance to make an informed decisions. So all of these measures makes it easier for international capital to be invested in developing countries.
So in this same aspect, there's multilateral development banks, right? There's a lot of discussion on reforms in these areas.
Yeah.
How do MDBs fit into this picture?
Yeah. So actually, to answer that question, there's another aspect to this that I should talk about before the MDBs, because policies and regulations in developing countries can lower investment risks, but they will not completely eliminate them. There'll still be some risks that will remain. To address these residual risks, we should scale up blended finance de-risking instruments that address targeted risks. Now, these risks could be economy-wide risks such as currency risk or political risk, or they can even pertain to investments in specific sectors. So depending on the type of risk, a suitable type of de-risking instrument can help investors also manage those risks. Now, in this context, I'd like to talk about the MDBs because this is relevant from that perspective. So yes, there is a debate about MDB reform, and that is because for many reasons, right? One is, of course, even like we noted that while some of the climate finance is routed through MDBs under the UNFCCC, the performance so far has been underwhelming. But the consensus is that currently MDBs are not the best equipped to tackle global challenges like climate change, and they need to be reformed. So what does that mean? Firstly, they need to be able to disburse capital at a much higher scale, right? So climate finance needs to be quadrupled. Not all that will come from MDBs, but even they will have to scale up. So one is scaling up their resources. The second is enhancing their capabilities to fund de-risking instruments through grant capital, because current business models of MDBs constrain the amount to which they can actually put towards those kinds of uses. So therefore, there is a need for reforms of MDB business models. And this is something that India's G20 presidency commissioned in the form of an independent expert group to look at what are the steps needed for MDB reform. So the independent expert group developed a blueprint, which is called the Triple Agenda Report. And this talks about various aspects needed to reform these institutions to make them better suited for funding global challenges, including climate action. So the recommendation of those reports, I'm not going into those right now, should be sort of implemented to reform these institutions. That's one. At the same time, because we need to channel so much finance, and because there's also an additional opportunity, one should also look at some other emerging initiatives, such as sustainable finance hubs, new sustainable finance hubs in developing countries themselves. A really good example of this is at home in India, which is GIFT IFSC, which is India's international facing financial hub located near Ahmedabad in Gujarat. So GIFT IFSC not only is an international facing financial hub, it also aspires to be a hub for sustainable finance for India. But the opportunity is to develop GIFT IFSC not only as a platform that serves the Indian market, but also serves developing countries beyond the immediate jurisdiction of India. So serves developing country in the entire region, in the region, let's say the Asian region or Southeast Asia, South Asia, whatever. The idea is that this not only will give global capital sort of a one-point solution to connect possibly with investment opportunities in various countries, it can also help address the deficiencies in the financial systems of smaller developing countries in mobilizing capital, because you have larger emerging economies like India facilitating transactions between capital, international capital, and investment opportunities. So emerging sustainable finance hubs like GIFT IFSC can be another opportunity. So to summarize, to quadruple climate finance, it's a huge undertaking. It requires simultaneous actions on multiple fronts. We need policy and regulation to create an enabling environment. We need to scale up de-risking instruments to address residual risks. And at the same time, we need to enhance the capacities of existing channels of delivery of climate finance to address the challenges of climate change. And here, twofold: MDBs as well as new emerging sustainable finance hubs.
Thanks for summarizing that as well. I think it's an intricate discussion which will come up at the upcoming COP as well. And it's important for listeners to know what these acronyms mean, what these different ideas are in terms of discussing as well as understanding what is happening in terms of the climate finance landscape in the world. Very interesting to also note that India is taking a lead in establishing such a financial hub to not only aid its own efforts, but also help other countries around it. So GIFT IFSC does sound like a promising effort on that front.
Absolutely. I mean, that's also one more piece of evidence in terms of India's growing climate leadership. So not only is India driving its own efforts, in the right spirit with sincerity, it's also creating possible opportunities if this were to be developed into a regional financing hub for other countries to also get access to capital from international sources.
Absolutely. So as we look ahead to the coming COP29, what outcomes are you hoping for, particularly in climate finance, because it is being labeled as the finance COP, so to say, or sometimes also some people are saying it's the carbon markets discussion that'll come up there.
Right. So firstly, fingers crossed, because there are many, many debates. So hoping is right. We'll have to see whether those hopes materialize. But you're right, this is a finance COP. So climate finance related discussions are the centerpiece of negotiations this time around, and particularly the determination of the NCQG. So we'll have to see if there's agreement reached on the NCQG, particularly on the quantum of the NCQG and what types of climate finance should count towards the NCQG, right? So those are two very specific aspects to look out for. And besides that, you're right, carbon markets are also an important aspect of this time of COP this time around. And this is because, just for a bit of context, the carbon markets under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there are two types of carbon markets, Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. The broad principles that are to govern these carbon markets were agreed at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. However, since then, negotiators have been working on finalizing the more granular rules that can help operationalize these carbon markets. So while progress has been made, there are still some outstanding issues, but there is some hope that these outstanding issues could be resolved this time around, and therefore we could also see Article 6 markets being operationalized at scale.
Yeah, so we just heard about the new recommendations a few days back, if I'm not mistaken, on Article 6.2 and 6.3.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, there are ongoing negotiations even outside of COP. So negotiations happen all the year round. There are various working groups that convene and work on various aspects of this. And ultimately, a final or a draft versions of those negotiated texts are presented to the wider body for their approval and, of course, further negotiation. So that's the way this works. And that's why you probably would have heard of, some recommendations in that regard. So certainly, carbon markets are another aspect to watch out for at COP29.
Yes, this has been an incredibly enlightening discussion. I think this is a base level episode for anyone interested in this field, right? Because we can have, like you said, when we were preparing for this, there can be several episodes just getting into each detail of what we discussed today. So for listeners, this is a very nice place to start. For all the listeners who are already at a level where this seems like fundamental 101 climate finance, we will have some more discussions for you lined up, hopefully soon. And until then, good luck for all your work. Good luck for the upcoming month-long activities before you head to COP with your key recommendations. And thank you for joining us today, Arjun.
Thank you so much, Sanika. This has been a lovely debate. I mean, discussion rather. I'm already in the climate negotiations mode.
Yeah.
And like I said, very important discussion. I fully enjoyed it. And thank you so much. We'll see how the COP goes, but climate finance is important for climate action. I'm so glad we had this chat today.
Likewise.